And some introductions as they settle in. Professor Dr. Sahuno, who is next to me here on the platform, he's the lead co-chair of the T20 Task Force on Meaningful Digital Connectivity, Cybersecurity and Empowerment. He's a professor of information technology at the Bandung Institute of Technology in Indonesia, and in a distinguished career, he's also advised the government of Indonesia on communications and information technology. Next to him is Desiree Milosevic, who's a celebrated member of the global internet governance community. She was a special advisor to the chair of the United Nations Multi-Stakeholder Group on Internet Governance, and has also represented corporations that manage part of the naming system used to identify computers and services on the internet. Next to her is Hal Kaiser, who is the chairman in Europe of the Global Business Advisors and Consultants, PwC. He was a member of the executive board in Germany for much of the last decade. Paul Toomey, you know already from his remarks. And joining us remotely, Michele Regneri, who's a senior expert in artificial intelligence and cognitive computing with a particular interest in AI innovation processes and corporate digital responsibility. She currently works for Otto, one of the world's biggest e-commerce companies, which is based in Hamburg. So welcome to all of you. Professor Dr. Sahuno, your thoughts initially as the lead co-chair of the T20 Task Force. What are your thoughts on this research?
Thank you. I think it's very interesting and the quality of result from GSI in regard to data governance. Data is very important, and the mindset people in the world must be safe from physical to cyber. And some country like Indonesia still consider how to make a data. But you said the data is everywhere, and also the industry is exposed, touching the data, and then how about the situation? The situation is very important. In my country also, health data, who is owned? The medical doctor or hospital? All the people, human. But no, it's not clearly. So I think the data must be controlled by consumer is very important, and there is still very hard challenge because to change the mindset from the government regulation and also from the industry and the people. This is, I think, is very interesting result, and then must be continue to make more doable in the country or the level, especially G20 as an asset to change our daily life, and data as our capital, data as our for the asset in our life, and then not only industry take advantage, but human is an offer in our society. I think I agree to consider the human-centered for the data navigation, digital transformation from datafication, digitalization, and digital transformation. It is still hard work to evolve to becoming the consumer as our objective, not only industry. So I support for the next, for our challenge for the customer first or human first, not machine first, not industry first, but for the human. I agree and I support it. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Dr. Sahuno, thank you very much. Desiree Milosevic, an important point there from Professor Dr. Sahuno, that we are catching up in a way with the technology industry. What are your thoughts?
Thank you. You are absolutely right that we're catching up, and you're absolutely right that this is so necessary, this human-centered internet governance, to protect users' rights, to protect how they, the information that they do not own about themselves, the data that is used for commercial purposes. So to catch up, this is a great organizational idea. It will take a lot of time to implement, in my view. Outside of these huge organizational idea, there's probably a lot that technical companies could do to limit the data they send over the services. But catching up is something that we'll have to do, and there's already a lot of good steps in Europe with the GDPR, with the Data Protection Act, with the Data Governance Act. We can see these are all good steps in the right directions, but they still do not give individuals transparency of the data, how the data is used, and whether they can participate in this market to actually even monetize it. And we also know that the Max Planck Institute has done a lot of research, legal research, whether this model described here could work, and they have proven that from a legal point it could work.
And that is an important point, because we have seen regulation to try to control, to give more agency to consumers. And when, from an international governance point of view, when such legislation comes in, the technology companies initially tend to say, well, we don't need it, and then they say, leave it with us, we will act in the best interests of our consumers. Can we trust them to do that?
It's a very good question, whether who should be in charge of the data and the control. And as you have said, we have seen that there could be some inertia initially to adopt this system. And we should be aware of it, but we should not give up in trying to do the right thing, to protect individuals, their data, and to protect this human-centered internet governance, which, as Paul has mentioned, and the State Secretary, will bring more cohesion in the society, which we are definitely seeing and lacking right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Michele Rigneri, joining us remotely, thank you for your participation in our deliberations today. I mentioned that you work with a major e-commerce operation, a business that uses data intensively. What does this research mean for that type of corporate activity? What does it mean for the areas in which you are a specialist, in areas like artificial intelligence?
I think it definitely means a step in the right direction. This might sound strange from a corporate perspective, but I think the mindset also in corporations has to change. So data is not a free commodity. It might feel as it is from time to time. If we collect it, then at first we don't have to pay it. But just the data as it stands doesn't carry any value. Just saving data somewhere on a USB stick or a huge server doesn't produce any value for a company, and also not for the consumers. It's actually the processing and the reasoning we do with data that creates value. And that means we have to be aware of the actual value of the data that we can produce from it. And this would also be the interesting information for the consumer. And I think this mindset change is good for all of us. If we as a corporation know the value of our data and precisely can actually calculate which data carries value for us and which data helps us to serve the consumer better, then we will move a huge step forward. Because as it stands, the tendency is to put as much data into artificial intelligence algorithms and reasoning algorithms as you have and as you can possibly get. But as you can see, when you actually analyze such systems, most of this data doesn't carry any necessary value for such systems. And if you can distinguish precisely the data that carries value for you, and also precisely can tell your customer which kind of data they can give us and which value we can give back. So say, give better services, or also say, we can give you better recommendations or something. Then we can make a fair trade. And also we as a corporation could save money at the end, because too much data is not only a problem for privacy and security, it's also a cost factor. It costs a lot of money. It costs also a lot in terms of sustainability, but also processing data costs time, it costs money. It is actually totally annoying at the end of the day. So processing data in a minimalistic way and being aware of the actual value of this data would be a huge step forward, but requires a lot of research. And I'm actually happy if such kind of research is protected and also supported by governmental decisions.
This is such an interesting point because it suggests that there is an incentive to companies that use data to embrace some of the ideas in Paul's research. And I wonder if that's why this is in your research. Michaela, that idea that they can benefit from higher quality data, that's the payoff. Is that how it is seen?
I feel like this, and not even necessarily only higher quality data. So some data we just don't need. So if we save a click on a, say, landing page of some homepage, I can't learn anything from that because 1 million people have done the same thing before. I don't need to say this click. That's a very basic example. But there is lots of data that we can't learn from, or even data that is harmful to creating value. So seeing it from an economic perspective, we automatically should embrace a user-friendly and data protective stance, simply because it saves us time and money and makes our algorithms even better. So, but that means we need things like explainable AI and a good knowledge about the systems and how they actually make decisions based on certain data points. And this is hard work, I admit, and it's not even clear how well this scales. But it's a necessary thing to do that would benefit everyone, including the environment, and but foremost, also the consumer.
Thank you very much. Desiree Milosevic, let me just bring you back in on this, because as an outsider, the instinct of the technology companies has appeared to be grab as much data as we can, because we don't know what might be useful, and then we'll find a use for it at some point in the future. If that's their instinct, how do we get them to the point where they are designing tech products and services that use data with consumer protection at its heart, that it's something that they think of naturally rather than having it imposed?
It will take a lot of effort. As I said earlier, there will be a lot of inertia coming from the big tech that has the most data right now. And that data has to be spread among the business market that is there that can find solutions. Obviously, the tech companies are not going to decide out of their own will. So we need governments, we need legislation, we need users to buy into this, we need awareness of this proposal so that there are some incentives for businesses, for the collective data to exist, for the data commons, as it's been described, that the society sees the benefits of the data and it just doesn't benefit the few. We know that some companies could collect not just metadata, which is the most important one, but also 499 points of data can be collected through a single interaction with a big online social platform or any other digital service interaction.
Thank you. Hal Kaiser from PwC, Chairman of Europe for that organization. Your thoughts on the research, and also perhaps a perspective for us on how policymakers and business work together to set the parameters for a more human-centric use of data.
Exactly, and then I would like to start a little bit more with the people aspect, because we are still starting again to speak about regulation. And Dennis made, I think, the very good example with the labor market hundreds of years ago, where we had slaves, and then it took a while until we have a working, functional labor market in place. And I think that's a little bit really comparable to where we are right now. And what are the reasons for that? And I see there are two reasons. So number one, people do not understand that the data they're creating have a value. And that has to do a lot with IT literacy. And that still, despite the fact that we are discussing that since 20 years, many people do not have the right IT-based knowledge to get an understanding what's possible. So therefore, this is, I think, an obligation for governments, but as well as for business. So we at PwC investing $1 billion now to upskill our people that they get the right understanding. So that's number one. If slaves do not know that there is a different market for them, then they will never go in this direction, and that's very similar to where we are. Number two is that also companies have the obligation to create transparency about the way they are using data. And that's a little bit the good citizen approach. So I think if everybody what we heard from the research, I think from the disease is there, and everybody will agree that there's a fundamental shift necessary. But having this in mind, that means that companies have to provide an overview and transparency how they use data and their business models. And we have already an initiative with the name ESG, environmental social governance. And the governance piece is currently very much related to board and to society, but we do not really have a data governance stream in that. And I think that's also a great opportunity for the business to come up with this kind of common data governance approach, which is not only related to the CIO or the IT department, that's really strategy and starts with the CEO, to report on that, and then also within the non-financial reporting to give their responsibility to the community. And I think these are two base requirements then to start with the economic business factor you are proposing, which is a great idea, but I think currently the fundamentals are not there. So therefore, and that doesn't have to be in sequence, we can do that in parallel, but I think we need both.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Dr. Suhunu,
Yeah.
what can the T20 achieve in this area?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think this is a very good and very good opportunity or challenge. So in my T20 approach, we as proposed, we call it living lab, and to set up an example or an initiation, and we can make some kind of sandbox regulatory, so we can limit to the small area, and then we can test what is the business model or model of data government that customer is one is our objective or human-centric can be done in a living lab. So in G20, we have one policy brief in progress and also one proposal for living lab. So we invite for the G7 or another party to set up, to implement the data governance with human center as our objective. This is because very big challenge, but we must try step by step and then understood in our experience in my country. So I invite for this living lab to implement what is the data government with the human as a center, human as our objective, customer protection, etc.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Michele Regneri, just a thought from you on when we talk about organizations like the G20 and the G7, how important is it to business at a practical level when those big global organizations set out policies or standards or frameworks? Does that have any influence on business? Is it remotely helpful?
Oh, well, I hope so. But also it depends strongly on the kind of business that you actually do have. So strong policies are initially, if they're not done carefully, always support the big ones. So we are happy as a big corporation, but if you think about small corporations that don't have the means or the lawyers to actually fulfill those policies, then they get a problem. So you have to be really careful when doing consumer protection to actually guarantee this consumer protection also with the big corporations and especially not damage the small ones. So keeping equality with policies, I think, is pretty hard. But setting good standards and also actually making adherence to this standard also some kind as an accreditation for big companies, I think is a very good idea.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul Twomey, I'm going to go back to you for the concluding sort of thoughts in this discussion. Just draw together the threads, the reaction, your response to the reactions to the...
It's great. Hang on. It's not so great if I don't use the microphone. This has really been very interesting. I want to come back to this issue that it is amazing the power of a market and the backwards and forwards. So to take the artificial intelligence example we got, part of the proposal we're putting forward here is not just the present system where companies surreptitiously take stuff out of consumers. This is a market where they can go back to consumers and say, and they've got a mechanism to go back to consumers and say, I would like to know more of this information if you're willing to share it with me. This information would be useful to me or not, etc. There's actually potentially in markets it works two ways, not just one way. And I recognise the points about skills in the consumer set, but if I can use an example from my home country in Australia, where the government in the 1990s produced a thing called superannuation, where basically said every Australian worker has to be paid money for their retirement, and they have to control that. Now, most Australians knew very little about how the stock markets worked and what have you. Most Australians still don't know how the stock markets really work. But what emerged to support them were funds and brokers and experts who were now on the side of them with that money to help them in the marketplace. And so I do think this idea of representation of in a market where people can have rights of association and representation and the skills follow that means that we don't have to wait a long period of time for everybody to be educated, providing I'm being represented by people who do understand how the systems work and give me that chance.
So sort of a data equivalent of trade unions or mutual friendly society.
Yeah, that's right. And in the labour market, we saw that. And so I think we could see similar things emerging. The role of government is essential. But the great thing about a market is that not one size fits all. And one of the problems with government regulation is that it tends to be one size fits all. So government underpinning a market, but the market having the flexibility we've talked about here, I think is probably a really good outcome.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're at that very, very dangerous stage of the morning where we are eating into people's lunchtime. So I think that this is as good a time as any to end our discussion here. I know that you'll join me in thanking Michele Regneri, who's joining us remotely, and you'll join me in thanking all of our panelists here in Berlin as well. Give them a round of applause to say thank you.